Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast. I'm really excited. Today, my guest is Don Orkoskey. Don is the owner of WDO Photography, a photography business based in Pittsburgh, PA. Don graduated from the Art Institute of Pittsburgh in 2001 before attending Point Park University and the University of Pittsburgh. After successfully working as an assistant and second photographer for several amazing photographers all around Pittsburgh, Don started WDO Photography in 2007. During Don's career, he has photographed a sitting president, taught classes to numerous talented photographers, and has had the privilege to help capture and tell some amazing stories. Don believes that everyone's story deserves to be recorded and preserved and loves having the opportunity to help people share their talents and tell their stories through photography. Well, welcome, Don, to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I am very excited to be here. For you to be here. I'm having one of those days. We all have those days. But let's jump into you and tell my listeners a little bit more about you, who you are, what you do, and what your passion is.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a photographer based in Pittsburgh. I also teach photography, which is something that I've done since basically when I opened my business. But during the pandemic, that really picked up because a lot of the other photography stuff that I do is event photography.
Mhm.
So as well as portraits. So teaching really became a big part of what I do, and it's still. I've been fortunate enough that it's still a huge part of what I'm doing now. So, but yeah, I grew up just outside of Pittsburgh, and I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until I was 42. Just going really close to 2 years ago now. So, but I've worked for a long time doing both photography classes as well as some other arts education stuff with kids and adults, but a lot of kids that are neurodivergent, either on the autism spectrum or with ADHD or other neurodiversity.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to want to jump into that ADHD diagnosis here in just a second. But before we get there, tell me, how did photography become part of your life? Like, is that something that's been going on since you were really young? But I mean, you sound passionate about it. So where did that first come about?
Yeah, when I was a kid, there was a portrait painter that lived across the street from my house, and I, typical hyperactive ADHD kid, was unable to sit still for most things, but I could sit and watch her paint someone's portrait for hours, like just using these pigments to pull someone's face out of a canvas was amazing to me. So I think that's what sort of got me into the art world. And of course, as a neurodivergent, there's a lot of creative thinking there to begin with. But then in high school, I took a photography class and yeah, just fell in love with it. So my mom said, you have to do something when you're going to graduate. You're graduating soon. What are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. And she said, well, you better figure that out. And I said, okay, I guess I'll go, become a photographer. And yeah, so that's when I went to the Art Institute and began to formally study. So, yeah.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So I have to ask you, I'm incredibly interested that you did not get a diagnosis of ADHD until you were 42 years old, which obviously is in terms of when people get diagnoses is later in life. I was in my 30s when I got my diagnosis. So again, later in life. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your journey about coming to terms or essentially recognizing that you were neurodiverse, and maybe what did it look like when you were growing up? Because I'm very curious to know how it was missed. Especially males typically get diagnosed or are identified sooner. But I'm wondering if maybe it was more of an internal type that was happening. I'm just curious. Tell me more about who you were when you were younger and growing up, and what did school look like for you?
Yeah, so I think the big um, uh, surge of diagnosis that happened in maybe the late 80s or early 90s, that I was just a tiny bit older than that.
Mhm.
So, so I think that's how I got missed, basically. Um, my father is definitely neurodivergent. He's never been diagnosed, but there's so many obvious signs now that I understand my own neurodiversity. Looking at him, it's obvious to me. But
Mhm.
I think because he's in the boomer generation, right, and that was absolutely not a thing, right? ADHD was not um, diagnosed. Even like autism spectrum disorder and things were not really understood. So I'm not sure what all he would be diagnosed with if he were to seek diagnosis. But um, yeah,
Mhm.
so I think partly there was just maybe an expectation that he has his like quirkiness or whatever, and that maybe there was some of that in me as well. Um, so school was definitely difficult. I remember second grade being obsessed with looking out the window and just at the trees and the clouds and um, but at the same time, you're learning to read in second grade, right? Um,
Mhm.
and I would read, there's like group reading, right, where the teacher calls on this student to read this paragraph and then the next student. And I would read way ahead and not even be able to pay attention to where we were. My reading skills were great.
Mhm.
And then I would just stare out the window because I was, loved nature. And that's still very much true. But it got me into trouble. And then getting into third grade, um, I was very much an auditory learner, and especially because things were starting to get more advanced in terms of math and stuff like that. Not that third grade's super advanced math, but when you're that age, right?
Right.
It's a little harder than the stuff that I was doing in second grade, right? So um, but you're expected to take notes at that point because you can write a little bit better. I didn't like taking notes, and I still don't like taking notes. Um, because it actually interferes with I think I have not been diagnosed with auditory processing disorder, but I think that there's something there as well. So um, I need that time to process, and I can't spend that time writing down, or otherwise I
Mhm.
miss things. And that was not okay for my teachers. I was messy and disorganized. So at one point, the teacher made me stand up, and in third grade, you have oftentimes the desks that are attached to the seat, right? So, and she picked up the desk and shook out the space underneath where all the stuff was. Um, she her last name I won't call her out too much, but her last name
Yeah,
started
she'd
with
be getting a letter from me.
yeah. Her last name started with a T, and they started calling her Super T, like the other students. So, yeah, and then going, forward into like middle school, high school, um, I was, I frustrated a lot of teachers because I wouldn't do homework,
Mhm.
and I could be disrupting in class. But when it came time to take a test, I often was the first one done, and I
Mm.
would get most things right. And at that, I mean, as a teacher who does, who again, because I'm a few years ahead of the big wave of diagnoses, um, that had to have been super frustrating. Here's this kid who's not listening, not paying attention, but he gets A's on the tests.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is into high school, I ended up in like remedial classes, which then I was incredibly bored because I'm not being challenged at all. So,
Yeah.
um, and the expectation for me was set very low, which obviously affects your self confidence. And again, I think with this bit of auditory processing stuff that affected things too, because people like want to fire a question at you, and I need like a minute to process that
Yeah.
and then respond. But so yeah, I definitely felt self-conscious, and my self-esteem was very low at that point. So, but at the same time, like I loved being creative. I loved, um, I got super excited about photography and jumped, headfirst into that. And I think that really carried me forward through that difficult stuff of being like, okay, well, I'm gonna, my mom has said, you're gonna have, I don't remember which, if it was Sports Illustrated or something like that. Like, you're gonna have the cover of Sports Illustrated or Newsweek or whatever. And I was like, I don't know about that, but but I'm definitely excited to to see what I can do. Right. So um, yeah, so that was my journey, and then as an adult, essentially, I've always sort of struggled with some of that like organizational stuff and the kind of typical atypical stuff, right,
Mhm.
to put it that way. So um but being diagnosed, like I said, almost 2 years ago now, has been super helpful. Exploring all this stuff, understanding all the masking I did. I remember in
Yeah.
high school, one other student said something about how um, they didn't like me. They said to a friend, they didn't like me because when I'm around this group of people, I act this way, and I'm around this group of people, I act this way, and like that hurt because
Yeah.
I didn't understand that other people didn't do that. But then I realized, with learning about ADHD, that and just neurodivergence in general, that I was masking, and I could
Mhm.
blend really well with this group of people. And so I had a very diverse group of friends in high school. I hung out with this crew and that crew, and so um and I think that's helped me in my photography a lot, because as an adult, being able to um being able to interact with different people without
Mhm.
necessarily, again, it's masking, right? But I recognize that it's sort of like
You
if
know
you
that it is now? Yeah.
yeah, it's sort of like if you work retail, that you have that retail voice, right? Or if you wait tables, you're like
Mhm.
super polite when you're waiting the table, but you might not be super polite
Mhm.
afterwards. So and
No.
learning that stuff is okay,
Yeah.
if you recognize what it is and you understand what it is, and it's not something that you're doing out of fear,
Mhm.
right? Or out of survival, but is something that you're doing because it's helpful for you in terms of interacting with people. And when you're willing to do it, I don't, you shouldn't be forced to do it, but and I don't feel forced to do it. I feel that it helps me with.
No, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. In fact, I can tell you when I was in high school, I had somebody say to me that they didn't like me because I was too nice, and nobody is that nice. And I was like, "Wait, being nice is a bad thing? Like, I am nice, but I'm not." Because I guess they were
Mhm.
thinking it was like a fake nice, but I'm like, "No, I don't like feeling bad about myself, so like I don't want to do stuff that makes people feel bad about them." And I realized even recently, I had somebody say to me, they go, "I bet you were that person who was friends with everybody in high school." And I was like, "I kinda was." Like, it was like you're almost a chameleon. And you're right, it's masking, I guess, to a sense, but, at the time, you don't realize that that's what you're doing, but you're almost a chameleon because you really can understand different people's point of views and perspectives, and so you do fit in well in different social situations. And you're right, it could be masking, it could be a defense mechanism because you don't want to deal with a level of rejection that it sometimes comes with when you're ADHD. There's a level of sensitivity with that, but I think what you're saying makes perfect sense. And for other people who are listening who are ADHD, I think it's good for them to hear that you had that experience. I had a very similar experience, and that's, I think, just being ADHD is, yeah, it can be masking, but it can also just be that you're a social chameleon and you really can get different people on different levels and fit in and understand them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of those things that with with photography, I'm working with, I'm working with the public. So I do a lot of event photography, so corporate events and nonprofit events, and
Mhm.
as well as like the occasional wedding, not too often, but weddings and private parties, things of that nature. But you meet people that come from all different walks of life and have different outlooks on life and different politics or different whatever. And if you, I think it's a I don't like the superpower thing, but I think it's a really helpful thing, to be able to, maybe, if there's somebody you completely disagree with politically, it's a little harder to do, but like to find things about, somebody when you first meet them in a conversation that, can really draw your interest in,
Mhm.
and you really can like learn something about this person in a genuine way. And in that instance, there, I think the being able to be a social chameleon is very helpful for that, because that puts people at ease, right? And as a
Mhm.
photographer, that's so important, because if you're taking someone's picture, you don't that stress, will translate to the photo if they're not
Mhm.
relaxed. So yeah.
No, that's a very good point. And I think that's important for people to hear that, there is times when it is it's a skill. It is a skill to have to be able to do that, and especially in your profession, like you said, for people to feel that level of comfort with you and quickly, right? Because it's not like you're spending days and days and days and days with people or months getting to know them. It's usually in the moment or at the event. So you want them to feel comfortable with you fairly quickly.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
exactly.
tell me what was it that happened at 42 that went, "I need to get this diagnosis?" How did that come about?
Uh, it's a classic case of memes. Uh,
Okay.
so it's neurodivergent people tend to we clump together, right?
Mhm.
And so I had friends on social media sharing memes that just hit home, and I was like, "Wow, this is um, this makes a lot of sense to me," or "Wow, that sounds like me." Uh, and they were from like, um, you know, Jen has ADHD, on Facebook, right? Like the Facebook page, right? So,
Mhm.
or these other like, different groups and different pages, and uh, they all were related to ADHD or neurodivergence or something like that. And I
Mhm.
was like, so I talked to my therapist, and my therapist said, um, "Oh, you don't know that you have ADHD? I thought you knew." So, um,
Okay.
yeah, and she said, a lot of people know and just don't bother to get diagnosed. Getting an official diagnosis is helpful for several things, such as medication, right?
Mhm.
And one of the things I did as a teen to try to, cope with ADHD, as well as some other stuff, abuse and things like that was happening to me, was used some drugs, drank a little bit, right? So was a bit of a wild child, um, and
Self-medicating.
yeah, self medication, without realizing that that's what I was doing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I've never been somebody who wanted to, because I had tried stimulating medication in the past. I was never somebody who wanted to use stimulants for my ADHD.
Mhm.
Um, and once I realized that that's what I had, um, and so I said to my therapist, "Well, I don't want to use stimulants." And she says, "Well, there's things other than stimulants." So that's, um, I don't remember what we tried first, but I'm now on Wellbutrin, which is working wonderfully. So we're super happy about that, because we tried. I don't remember what the other one is, but there's another. I think it's, an antidepressant as well, but
Mhm.
that one I had some issues with, and I don't even remember what those issues were. But the my psychiatrist said, "Well, it's Wellbutrin then, or stimulants, or nothing." So I
Mhm.
was like, "I hope the Wellbutrin works," and it did, thankfully.
Good.
So, and again, I don't like, if anybody that needs, a stimulant, Adderall or whatever it is, nothing, I have nothing against people taking the proper medication for them. I mean, I needed to find proper medication for me. I just, because I had had experiences as a teenager with stimulant medication, it was something that I just wasn't interested in personally.
Oh, no, absolutely, that makes sense, and they're not all created the same. I think people think, "Oh, it's an ADHD medication, it'll work for you," and it's not. When I first got medicated and they put me on Adderall, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I felt exhausted. Like maybe I got a good couple hours in the morning, but like by mid-afternoon while I'm still at work, it was like I hadn't slept in 2 weeks kind of feeling. And I'm like, I can't function like this. I mean, I don't necessarily enjoy being like spaced out and not able to focus all the time, but I don't like that I feel like I have to take a nap in the middle of the day either. And eventually I was put on Vyvanse. And then that was like a night and day difference for me, significant. And I'm like, this is what it's like to be able to get stuff done and focus and be driven to do things. So you're right. It's all about what works for you. And they're not all created equal. So it's all about what you need as an individual. So I think that's a very valid point that you brought up, and I'm glad that you brought it up so that people can know that there's different options out there, and it is all about what you need as an individual. I always like to think that in neurotypical world, it's like one size fits all for everything. In neurodiverse world, we're open to the idea that like everybody's an individual. Even though you and I both have ADHD, it can look wildly different
Yeah.
from person to person, and the needs are wildly different from person to person as well. Even though there might be some similarities, maybe we both have a hard time getting to stuff on time, maybe not, but you know what I mean. There's some similarities, but there's also a lot of things that are an individual type of thing as well.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up getting to things on time because I am habitually early. um,
You're
and
like, no,
it's
that is not an issue for me.
yeah, but the reason that it's not an issue for me
Mm,
is because it is an issue, right? So
mm,
I have to be places 10 minutes early, 15 minutes early because of, being late so many times as a kid and being told that that's
mm,
not okay. And, it's like not forgetting keys. Like I don't forget my keys, right?
mm,
um, I don't forget my debit card, right? Because those were things that happened. Not, I mean, a debit card as a kid, but like I remember when I first learned to drive. We didn't. It was This is how long ago it was. We used cash still to
mm,
pay for gas. So I would count the money when I pulled up to the pump
mm,
before I even got out of the car, and then I would count it again before I started pumping. And I made sure that I had, if it was $20, or whatever it was, that I had the money, and I, wasn't going to. Yeah, I mean, I didn't fear like getting arrested for for not having the money to pay for the gas, but I feared the embarrassment, right? So
yeah.
so it was something that I taught myself, as a coping mechanism or as a workaround, right? This way around these things, as we sometimes do.
No, and that makes sense. I feel like a lot of times some of our good habits have come from having something go really bad and not liking the feeling of whatever that rejection or failure or whatever it might be. And then we develop this better habit because we don't want to have that experience again. But the unfortunate aspect is having to have such a negative experience in order to sometimes develop that better habit.
Yeah,
Where some
absolutely.
people don't have to have that. They just go, "This is a good habit. Let me just put that in place." And it's not like that for everything, but I definitely think that sometimes I don't necessarily look at failure as a bad thing, but because sometimes the failure is what helps me remember or keep in mind. Like I'm somebody who I read emails probably not really 20 times, but excessively amounts of times before I hit that send button. Because when I first got out of college and I was working, I sent an email that I did like careless mistakes in. And it wasn't something I did on purpose. It wasn't my intention. I guess I just hadn't reread my email. I wrote it and then I sent it. And this guy who I sent it to reached out to my boss and essentially like, how, like, why are you allowing this type of email to go out? And it was just because there was like a spelling mistake or a grammatical mistake. I mean, he was very, very critical. But now that was almost 20 some years ago, and that sticks out in my mind. And so I still read emails like 5 times through before I'll hit the send button because I will never forget that experience and how I felt having that message provided to me. Because again, it wasn't something that I had intended to do.
Yeah, yeah, that's powerful. It really is, and it has such a big psychological impact on us when we have those experiences. Yeah.
It does. I think for a lot of ADHD people, it does because I think for most of us, some of those careless mistakes or things that happen were definitely not things that we did intentionally, or, I don't think anybody ever wants to fail. And unfortunately, I feel like when people with ADHD do make mistakes, I feel like they tend to be more like out there, like in your face mistakes. And again, we weren't intending for it to happen and it wasn't intentional. And so when we get that feedback, it hurts. It stings to get that feedback, because it wasn't like, well, yeah, I knew I should have read it. Like, it wasn't what I had no idea that I had done that, and would obviously now I'm embarrassed that that has happened type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I still have like little hiccups. I think everybody does. But
Yeah.
I taught a student today, and he has muscular dystrophy, so he's bedbound. He doesn't have a lot of range of motion
Mm.
with his arms or legs, but because of the muscular dystrophy, he's also immunocompromised. So and we're working very close together. So I would wear a mask even if
Mhm.
even if he weren't immunocompromised. But I normally just grab the mask out of the car. I have a box of masks in there. I grab
Mhm.
my cameras, grab my laptop, grab my tripod, and grab my mask. And for whatever reason, I just didn't grab my mask. And he lives with his grandmother, so she let me in the building.
Mhm.
And went to go back into his room, and I was like, I don't have my mask. Like, what am I doing? Right? And yeah, and it's one of those things that, I mean, again, fortunately, I don't have any symptoms right now, and I put a mask on immediately because I had
Mhm.
one in my. Because I always keep extras, had one in my my laptop bag. But
Right.
yeah, it was one of those things, right? That you're right, that there are these like out there things like, well, if I did have COVID right now, and I could really cause some serious harm. So yeah, but yeah.
Oh, well, let me ask you, I'm going to transition to this then. So you mentioned that you work with students, you're a teacher. Have you always you mentioned that you worked with some neurodiverse youth too. Is that something you were doing before you realized that you had ADHD, or is that something that maybe came about once you learned that you had ADHD? You're like, I want to make sure I'm helping and supporting students who are also experiencing this as well.
No, fortunately, it was prior. I think more than 10 years ago, I
Mhm.
had a partnership with a puppeteer. I know it sounds a little weird, photography and puppetry, but we were close friends, and so we were doing like South Park style stop motion animation stuff.
Okay.
Um, and we did an event at the Pittsburgh Children's Museum. They said you guys should apply to do an artist residency here, so we did that. Then they said you guys should apply for this bigger grant at this other organization, and we did that. And then we started to look for additional clients to teach. And the Andy Warhol Museum is here in Pittsburgh. They do a lot of outreach, like a lot of museums. They have education department that does a lot of outreach. And Dave, my business partner at the time, he actually got a job there. So we not only did some work for them through our little side business, but he got a job there. And because he's this amazing sculptor, um, they sent him to a school that is specifically for folks that are on the spectrum. And he's an amazing sculptor, and he makes little faces out of clay, and was
Mhm.
having the kids manipulate I think they were around like fourth graders, maybe sixth graders, manipulating the faces from different emotions, right, to try to understand how to read emotions better. um, and so we did that quite a few times. We spent a lot of time out there with them.
Wow.
We also worked with adults with disabilities. And interestingly enough, the University of Pittsburgh Medical School reached out to the Warhol Museum, and we taught them the same lesson of how to read emotions on faces by manipulating these clay figures. So because it's not just a thing that if you're you know struggling with autism, um, uh, that you could potentially have issues with understanding somebody's emotion. But also, if you're a doctor and you're, if you're, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, if you're so focused on, especially as these were folks that were, I think, just finishing medical school, so they were going to go into their residency. But those folks don't sleep very much when they're doing their residency, so it's a very stressful time for them. So reminding them, like, pay attention to your patients' faces, and are they in pain? Are they smiling? Right? Like, was really, it was fun and also rewarding, because that is something that they, without that lesson, I think that they would probably not understand that they need to do that better. They need to be better at reading emotions. So.
Oh, wow. I love that. That was kind of a really interesting concept. I had never even thought about that. The being able to read emotions and faces. And that's really neat that you were able to get connected with that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So from that, like I said, we did some stuff with, there was a adult program here in Pittsburgh that we did a lot of work with, and more outreach with the Warhol Museum, as well as some stuff that we did individually. We did some stuff at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh as well. And then, it was probably a few years. Dave, my business partner, the previous business partner, moved away. And so I was focused more on photography, but with the pandemic, I got more into teaching, got diagnosed, and was like, okay, this is I can put this to use. And I've always been very empathetic. So if somebody hires me for family photos, I try to be very conscious and very careful and very aware, because that can pictures can be stressful, right? Family pictures can be very stressful. I've talked to moms that say, I changed my shirt 3 times because I sweat through it, right? Because a lot falls on mom, right? And mom's like getting everybody ready. And if they've got a kid who's nonverbal, or who's in a wheelchair, or has something else that is that requires some sort of adaptive stuff, or any sort of anything that might change from being typical, right? There's that worry, that fear that parents have of, who is this person that I'm going to encounter, right? Are they going to be understanding? Are they gonna rush us? Is this going to work out? And there's also plenty of parents that I've unfortunately found that the picture is, what they're so focused on. We have to get a good picture. And for me, I don't want to traumatize anybody just for a photograph, because that one photograph when you're in, 8th grade that traumatized you means the rest of your life you're going to hate having your picture taken. And I don't want that. In addition to just it's not good in any form to be traumatized, but let alone over something like a picture. Like, it's a picture, it's okay. So if we need extra time, if there's other accommodations that have to be made, I'm always willing to do that stuff and put that out there. Like, if there's info on my website about how that's something that I'm conscientious of, and that I really put into practice. Like, if you show up and your kid's just dysregulated and having a rough day, like, okay, let's reschedule. I'm not going to say, oh, you didn't cancel within 24 hours, so we need a rescheduling fee and stuff like that. Like, no, this is, there's enough stress going on, right, in everyone's lives.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. So, but with with things starting to open up again, I got a call back in the spring from the state of Pennsylvania, from their vocational offices. So they help folks with disabilities transition from high school to working. And they said, we have this young man, and he's really interested in photography, and he is bedbound since they said he's bedbound since the pandemic. Will it be a problem to teach him? And I said, no, I don't think so. And this is my little buddy Brandon, who has muscular dystrophy, but he is also neurodivergent. So going in and working with him has been helpful in many ways for me. I think hopefully as much or hopefully like he's gotten, and I know that he's gotten a lot out of it, because he tells me I'm not allowed to leave and stuff like that. So but I've learned a lot about, not just about neurodivergence, but about my own auditory processing stuff, about slowing down, about focusing on things that are within everyone's skills, right? So because again, he has very little range of motion, so figuring out adaptive things like we put some software on his phone so he can trigger the camera, and we've ordered some things, a tripod that will turn and tilt so that he can control that in order to face the camera different ways and stuff like that. So,
that's fantastic. I love that. I love that. Well, Don, as we get close to the end of our interview here, I do want to ask you a couple more things. And the first one is, if people want to work with you, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to book a session with you, where would be the best place for them to go and do that or connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. So, but my website is probably the quickest way. So that's WDOphoto.com. Those are my initials. I know I go by Don, but my first name is actually William. So WDOphoto.com, or on any of those social platforms. If you just search for WDO Photo. That's probably the best way to reach me. And I do virtual classes as well. People have seemed a little reluctant, I think, now that this idea that the pandemic's over. People, I think, are just burnt out on Zoom. So, but if somebody's far away, or if they are immunocompromised or something like that, and they want to do virtual, I'm all about it. So
that's fantastic. Awesome. Well, before we go, I have to ask you one last question. It's the question I like to ask all of my guests. And that is, if you could give advice right now to a young person, young adult who is struggling academically or social emotionally, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. I mean, I've been through it, right? So, and it was rough. I remember those days. I would say find your people, people that genuinely care about you, people that will look out for you, and people that will help you to find a larger community, whether that's your family, whether that's your friends, whether that's a professional, mental health or medical professional. There are people out there, good people out there, that you can find that will help you through things. You just have to not be afraid to ask for help. And I know that, trust me, I know that that's a struggle at times, right? So, especially if we've been told like, oh no, don't, what you're asking for is strange. Like, no, because I got that, right? Like, oh, you're a little weird, like, but you know what? There's a lot of people out there that, we're all a little weird. So,
Very true.
But there's people out there that are truly empathetic, that truly care, and that want to help, and will, and it's not a burden for them. It really isn't a burden. So don't think that you're burdening those folks.
I love that. That is great advice. Well, Don, thank you so much for coming on the Neurodiverse Teacher podcast today. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story, for sharing your time. I truly appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan. I love your podcast. So I'm super honored to have been on it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that. Well, I'm honored to have had you here. And thank you to all my listeners for tuning in. And I will check you out next week on the Neurodiverse Teacher podcast.